The Queen refused to knight Ozzy Osbourne, not because of scandal, not because of controversy, but because of what he was wearing. On a day meant to celebrate honor and legacy, Buckingham Palace was filled with elegance. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors. Cameras flashed as politicians, generals, and celebrities stood perfectly dressed, every button aligned, every shoe shining. This was royalty at its most formal. And then Ozzy Osbourne walked in. No tailored suit, no royal smile, no attempt to blend in. He wore black, worn unmistakably him. Rings wrapped around his fingers. His hair was untamed, his presence calm but heavy, like someone who didn't need permission to exist in the room. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Whispers spread like ripples in still water. Some guests frowned. Some laughed quietly. Others stared, unsure if they were witnessing confidence or disrespect. Ozzy didn't notice, or maybe he did, and simply didn't care. As he approached the ceremonial area, a royal aide stepped forward, voice tight with rehearsed politeness. "Sir, there is a dress protocol for today's ceremony." Ozzy looked down at himself, then back up. "This is how I dress," he replied softly. Moments later, the room shifted. The Queen's gaze landed on him, sharp, assessing. The music faded. The murmurs died. Every camera froze in anticipation. This was supposed to be a moment of celebration. Instead, tension filled the air. "This ceremony," the Queen said, her voice calm but firm, "is meant to honor dignity, tradition, and respect." She paused. "Not rebellion." The words cut through the hall. A few guests exchanged looks of satisfaction. Others felt uncomfortable, like they were watching something they shouldn't. Ozzy Osbourne, a man whose music had changed generations, stood there silently judged, not for his impact but for his appearance. The sword remained lowered, the honor withheld. And in that moment, everyone expected Ozzy to apologize, to explain himself, to bow to tradition. But instead, he did something no one in that palace was prepared for. And what happened next would change the entire ceremony. The palace had been preparing for weeks. Every detail of the knighting ceremony was rehearsed to perfection. The carpets were aligned by hand. The guards practiced their steps until they moved like mirrors of each other. Invitations were reviewed, and approved by layers of aides whose only job was to make sure nothing unexpected happened. Because at Buckingham Palace, unexpected was unacceptable. Guests arrived early, each one dressed to signal belonging, dark suits. Medals pinned carefully. Dresses chosen not to stand out, but to fit in. This room rewarded obedience to tradition more than individuality. Ozzy Osbourne wasn't supposed to fit in, but he was supposed to comply. When his name was announced on the list of honorees, it caused quiet debate behind closed doors. Some advisors praised his cultural impact. Others questioned whether a man known for rebellion, chaos, and loud music could ever truly represent royal values. In the end, they agreed on one thing: he would be honored, as long as he respected the rules. That message was sent, clearly, formally, repeated more than once. Dress appropriately, behave appropriately, disappear into the ceremony like everyone else. But Ozzy never built his life by disappearing. Backstage, aides whispered nervously as they saw him arrive. One glanced at another, hoping someone else would speak first. Is that really what he's wearing? He didn't bring a suit. Did anyone warn him properly? They had. He just hadn't changed. Ozzy stood quietly near a stone column, hands folded, eyes roaming the room with calm curiosity. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't impressed. He looked like a man who had stood on louder stages, faced harsher judgment, and survived far worse than whispers behind velvet curtains. He remembered every time he had been told to tone it down, every executive who said his sound was too much, every critic who said he didn't belong. And yet, here he was. A senior royal aide finally approached him, clearing his throat with forced authority. "Sir Ozzy," he said softly, "this is a formal state ceremony. There is an expectation of presentation." Ozzy nodded politely. "I understand." The aide gestured subtly toward his outfit. "If you could, reconsider." Ozzy looked down at his clothes again. Black fabric worn by time, not neglect. Jewelry collected over decades of life lived loudly and honestly. This wasn't rebellion for show. This was history stitched into fabric. "This isn't a costume," Ozzy said. "It's me." The aide didn't know how to respond. Across the hall, the Queen's advisors were already watching. They saw the pause, the hesitation, the quiet tension forming where none was supposed to exist. One of them leaned in and whispered urgently, "This could become a spectacle." Another replied, "Then it must be corrected immediately." The ceremony could not allow disruption, not on a day meant to symbolize order, tradition, and control. As Ozzy was guided closer to the center of the hall, eyes followed him, some curious, some judgmental, some quietly respectful. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Change, or be rejected. For the palace, the choice was simple. For Ozzy Osbourne, it never had been. And as the Queen prepared to make her final decision, one thing became painfully clear. This ceremony was no longer about honor. It was about identity, and someone was about to be tested. The hall fell into a silence that felt heavier than any applause ever could. Ozzy stood alone at the center of the palace floor, surrounded by gold, marble, and centuries of unspoken rules. Every eye in the room was on him now, not as an artist, not as a legend, but as a problem that needed to be handled. The Queen's expression did not change, but everyone felt it. This was a judgment. "Sir Osbourne," she said slowly, her voice controlled, measured, and unmistakably final. "This honor represents discipline, tradition, and respect for the institutions." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Your appearance suggests otherwise." A ripple of murmurs spread through the guests. Some nodded quietly, as if agreement was expected. Others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. A few couldn't hide their smirks, the kind that came when someone else was being corrected in public. Ozzy felt it all, the judgment, the distance, the invisible line being drawn between who belonged and who didn't. A royal aide stepped forward quickly, sensing the tension escalating. "Perhaps," he suggested softly, "Sir Osbourne would like a moment to reconsider his attire." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an exit ramp. Change your clothes, apologize, return quietly, or don't return at all. The cameras were still rolling. Every second stretched. This was the moment people expected Ozzy to bend. He didn't. Instead, he lifted his head and met the Queen's gaze. His face showed no anger, no embarrassment, just calm, the kind that unsettles people who rely on authority to feel powerful. "With respect," Ozzy said, his voice steady but gentle. "I didn't come here to make a statement." A few guests leaned forward. "I came because I was invited." The aide stiffened. That wasn't part of the script. The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly. "An invitation," she replied, "comes with expectations." Ozzy nodded slowly. "So does respect." The word echoed. Respect. A quiet gasp escaped from somewhere in the crowd. This wasn't defiance, not openly, but it wasn't submission either, and that made it dangerous. A man in the front row whispered sharply to his companion. "He should know better," another muttered. "This is what happens when you honor rebels." Behind them, a younger guest clenched her hands, eyes fixed on Ozzy, silently hoping he wouldn't back down, even though she knew he probably should. The Queen turned slightly to one of her advisors, her voice low but audible enough. "We cannot proceed like this." The meaning was clear. The sword remained at rest. The honor remained suspended. The room held its breath. Ozzy felt the moment pressing in on him, the expectation to explain himself, to justify decades of identity in a single sentence that would make everyone comfortable. He thought of every time he'd been told to change, to soften his sound, to clean up his image, to be someone else. Just long enough to be accepted. "I've stood on stages where people threw bottles," he said quietly. "I've been told I was a disgrace, a phase, a mistake." Some guests shifted uncomfortably. "But I never pretended to be something I wasn't," Ozzy continued. "Not for money, not for fame, and not for approval." The Queen's expression hardened. "This ceremony is not about you," she said. "It is about honor." Ozzy smiled faintly. "Honor," he repeated, "isn't stitched into a suit. That was it. The tension snapped. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the hall. This wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. This was confrontation. Security glanced at one another. Advisors stiffened. The palace itself seemed to hold still. Ozzy took a step back, not in fear, but in acceptance. If my presence offends the room, he said calmly, I'll leave. And with that, he turned slightly toward the exit. No apology, no bow. No retreat dressed up as compliance. Just a man walking away from a crown. And in that exact moment, as Ozzy took his first step, something shifted. Because power hates being abandoned, and the palace was about to realize this story was no longer under its control. Ozzy's footsteps echoed louder than expected. Each step toward the palace doors felt deliberate, unhurried, not rushed, not dramatic. And somehow that calm unsettled the room more than anger ever could. This wasn't a man storming out. This was a man choosing to walk away. The silence followed him. No applause. No protest. Just the uncomfortable sound of fabric shifting as people adjusted in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing the end of a ceremony or the beginning of something far bigger. A royal guard glanced sideways at his superior, silently asking for instruction. None came. Behind Ozzy, murmurs began to spread, low, cautious, almost guilty. Is he really leaving? Did that just happen? He was supposed to kneel. A woman in the second row covered her mouth, eyes wide. A man near the aisle shook his head slowly, as if trying to convince himself this wasn't real. Cameras hesitated, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut away. This moment hadn't been rehearsed. There was no protocol for dignity choosing not to beg. Ghazi reached the halfway point to the doors. That was when something subtle changed. An older gentleman seated near the edge of the hall leaned forward. His posture was stiff, his suit perfectly pressed. But his eyes told a different story. They followed Ozzy not with judgment, but recognition. Wait, he whispered to no one in particular. I remember him. The words were barely audible, but they landed. Another guest nearby turned. What do you mean? I was there, the man continued softly, almost to himself. In the early days when they said he'd disappear, when no one wanted to touch that music. A younger aide overheard and frowned. He's still breaking rules, she said quietly. The man didn't look away from Ozzy. No, he replied. He's refusing to pretend. Ozzy slowed, sensing something behind him. Not danger, but attention. Not the sharp, evaluative kind. Something heavier, something human. The Queen remained seated, eyes fixed on his back. This wasn't defiance anymore. Advisors shifted closer to her, voices low and urgent. This is escalating. The optics are dangerous. He's leaving without resistance, that's worse. If he exits like this. They didn't finish the sentence, because everyone in that room understood what it meant. A legend walking away from the crown, calmly, publicly, would live forever. Not as disrespect, but as refusal. Ozzy reached the doors. The massive panels loomed in front of him, carved with symbols of authority older than his entire career. He stopped, just for a moment, his hand hovering inches away from the handle, not to hesitate, but to breathe. Behind him, the room was unraveling. One advisor whispered sharply, "This isn't how history is supposed to look." Another replied, "History doesn't ask permission." A young guard swallowed hard, grip tightening on his ceremonial staff. He had been trained for threats, disruptions, emergencies, not quiet dignity that made authority feel suddenly fragile. Ozzy lowered his hand. He didn't turn around. He didn't look back for approval or forgiveness or recognition. And that's when it happened. A single sound cut through the tension. Not loud, not commanding, just firm stop. The word echoed, not because it was shouted, but because it was final. Every movement froze. Ozzy paused. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. The Queen had risen from her seat. The advisors fell silent instantly. Guards straightened. Guests leaned forward, hearts pounding. This wasn't part of the ceremony anymore. This was instinct colliding with tradition. She took a step forward. Her gaze moved past the clothes, past the rules, past the defiance. For the first time, she wasn't looking at what Ozzy represented to the institution. She was looking at what he represented to people. The room held its breath, because everyone felt it now. Whatever came next would not just decide the fate of a knighthood. It would decide what the crown stood for. And Ozzy Osbourne, standing between the doors and the throne, had unknowingly forced the palace into a choice it could no longer avoid. The word hung in the air, stop. Ozzy turned fully now. For the first time since entering the palace, he faced the room again, not as a guest, not as a rebel, but as a man who had already accepted the outcome. His expression didn't ask for mercy. It didn't demand validation. It simply waited. The queen stood alone, a few steps forward from the throne. The sword remained in her hand, lowered but no longer forgotten. The room felt smaller somehow, like the walls themselves were leaning in. She studied him, not his clothes, not his rings, not the parts that had made everyone uncomfortable. She studied him. "You were invited here," she said slowly, her voice carrying without effort. "Because of influence." Some guests exchanged looks. "Not popularity," she continued. "Not noise, but impact." Ozzy didn't speak. "I am told," the queen went on, "that rules give institutions strength." She paused. "But institutions also decay when they forget why those rules existed in the first place." A quiet shift rippled through the hall. Advisors stiffened. This wasn't on the page. This wasn't rehearsed. This was dangerous territory. Reflection instead of control. The queen turned slightly, addressing the room now. "How many of you," she asked, "changed who you were to be accepted here today?" No one answered. "How many of you learned early," she continued, "that fitting in was safer than standing out?" A few eyes dropped. Ozzy felt something tighten in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but recognition. This wasn't a defense. This was an admission. She turned back to him. "You represent a contradiction," the queen said. "You challenge order, yet you command loyalty. You reject polish, yet you shaped culture." She gestured gently toward his clothes. "These garments made some in this room uncomfortable." Then she lifted her chin. "So did your music." A murmur spread. Not laughter, not disapproval, understanding. Ozzy finally spoke. "I never tried to be respectable," he said quietly. "I tried to be honest." The queen nodded once. "That," she replied, "is rarer." She stepped closer now. The distance between crown and artist shrank to a few feet. Cameras dared to move again. History leaned forward. "You could have changed," she said. "You were asked to. You chose not to." Ozzy met her gaze. "I wouldn't know who I was if I did." Silence. Then the queen turned, not away from him, but toward the audience. "Too often," she said, "we mistake conformity for character." Her voice sharpened just slightly. "And too often we reward obedience while pretending it is virtue." Ozzy felt something tighten in his chest, not pride, not relief, but recognition. This wasn't a defense. This was an admission. She turned back to him. "You represent a contradiction," the queen said. "You challenge order, yet you command loyalty. You reject Polish, yet you shaped culture." She gestured gently toward his clothes. "These garments made some in this room uncomfortable." Then she lifted her chin. "So did your music." A murmur spread, not laughter, not disapproval, understanding. Ozzy finally spoke. "I never tried to be respectable," he said quietly. "I tried to be honest." The queen nodded once. "That," she replied, "is rarer." She stepped closer now. The distance between crown and artist shrank to a few feet. Cameras dared to move again. History leaned forward. "You could have changed," she said. "You were asked to. You chose not to." Ozzy met her gaze. "I wouldn't know who I was if I did." Then the queen turned, not away from him, but toward the audience. "Too often," she said, "we mistake conformity for character." Her voice sharpened just slightly. "And too often we reward obedience while pretending it is virtue." This wasn't just about Ozzy anymore. This was about them. The sword rose. A collective breath caught in hundreds of throats. "Ozzy Osbourne," she said formally, "you changed the sound of a generation. You gave voice to those who felt unseen, and you did so without asking permission. She paused. That is influence. Ozzy's shoulders lowered, not in submission, but in release. The Queen stepped forward and touched the blade gently to his shoulder. Not because of tradition, but in spite of it, gasps rippled across the hall. Some guests looked stunned, others looked unsettled. A few smiled, small, private smiles, like they had just witnessed something real in a room built on symbols. As the sword lifted away, the Queen added quietly, not for the cameras, not for the room, but for him. Never apologize for being intact. The words landed heavier than the honor itself. Ozzy exhaled slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply bowed his head, not to the crown, but to the moment. Because the reveal wasn't that he was worthy of the honor. The reveal was that the honor had almost missed him. And everyone in that palace knew it. The applause came late. Not because people didn't know when to clap, but because they weren't sure if they were allowed to. The palace had rules for ceremony, for protocol, for praise, but it had no script for a moment like this. When the clapping finally began, it wasn't thunderous. It was hesitant at first, then steadier, then honest. Not celebration, recognition. Ozzy remained still. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't turn to the cameras. He stood there as if the noise belonged to someone else. The Queen returned the sword to its place and stepped back, her expression composed once again. The ceremony resumed, but something fundamental had shifted. The air felt different, lighter, as if a pressure no one realized they were carrying had been released. Guests whispered, not in mockery now, but reflection. Did you hear what she said? That wasn't planned. He didn't bend, and she noticed. A senior advisor leaned toward another, voice tight. This will be discussed for years. Good, the other replied quietly. It should be. Ozzy was guided toward the side of the hall, away from the center. An aide approached, unsure of his tone. Sir, congratulations, Ozzy nodded politely. Thank you. That was all. No speech, no victory lap. As other honorees stepped forward in pristine suits and practiced smiles, Ozzy watched from a distance, not with bitterness, with understanding. He had already stood in the hardest place, alone, unshielded and unmoving. An older clerk from the palace staff passed by and paused. His uniform was modest, his role invisible to most. He hesitated, then spoke softly. I saw everything, the man said. Ozzy met his eyes. Thank you, the clerk added, for not pretending. Ozzy smiled then. Small, genuine. Someone had to. Across the room, the Queen observed quietly. Not with regret, with calculation. She had upheld tradition for decades. She knew exactly what she had done, and what it would cost. Some would praise her courage, others would criticize her weakness. But leadership, she knew, was not about pleasing everyone. It was about choosing what deserved to endure. When the ceremony ended, guests filed out in orderly lines, but conversations spilled beyond the palace doors. News spread faster than protocol ever could. He almost walked away. She stopped him. It changed the tone of everything. Outside, Ozzy stood briefly at the steps. The sky was gray, the air cool. He took a breath that felt deeper than usual, like the end of a long note held just long enough. A reporter called out, Sir Ozzy. How does it feel to be knighted? Ozzy paused, then turned. It feels the same as it did before, he said calmly. I know who I am. Then he walked away. Inside the palace, aides began rewriting press statements. Advisors prepared explanations. Historians somewhere would argue about meaning and legacy, but none of that touched Ozzy. Because the resolution wasn't the knighthood. The resolution was this. He hadn't been accepted because he changed. He had been accepted because he refused to. And in a building built on tradition, that quiet truth echoed louder than any anthem. Long after the palace doors closed, the moment refused to fade. It replayed in people's minds, not as a scandal, not as rebellion, but as a question that felt uncomfortably personal. What does respect really look like? For some, it had always meant fitting in, learning the rules early, dressing the right way, speaking at the right time, never standing out too much, never making anyone powerful uncomfortable. That's what most of the room had done that day. Ozzy Osbourne didn't. And that's why the moment mattered. Because the truth is, Ozzy didn't win that day by being knighted. He won the moment he chose to walk away rather than erase himself. The crown didn't give him value. It was forced to recognize it. That distinction changed everything. Too many people spend their lives shrinking, sanding down their edges, hiding the parts that don't fit neatly into expectations. Not because they're wrong, but because they're tired. Tired of being told to adjust. Tired of being judged before they're understood. Ozzy stood in one of the most traditional rooms on earth and refused to do that. Not loudly, not angrily, just honestly. And that quiet honesty did something rare. It exposed the difference between authority and worth. Authority demands obedience. Worth exists whether it's approved or not. The palace learned that lesson in real time. So did everyone watching. Because the uncomfortable truth is this. Most people in that room were rewarded not for who they were, but for how well they followed the script. Ozzy was almost denied honor because he didn't, and that should make anyone pause. How many times have you been told to tone it down to be accepted? How many times have you hidden your voice to avoid friction? How often have you been polite instead of real? The world praises originality after it succeeds, but punishes it while it's standing alone. That's why this moment resonated, not because a rock legend met a queen, but because someone chose integrity over approval, and didn't flinch when the room tested him. True confidence doesn't shout, true power doesn't beg, and true respect isn't earned by costumes, titles, or permission. It's earned when you stay whole under pressure. Ozzy walked into a palace wearing himself. And for a moment, the palace had to decide whether it respected tradition more than truth. That decision echoed far beyond those walls. So here's the real question this story leaves behind. Not about Ozzy, not about royalty, but about you. If being yourself cost you approval, would you still do it? Would you walk away quietly knowing who you are, even if no one clapped? Because one day the thing you were asked to change might be the very reason you're remembered. Do you believe Ozzy was right to stay himself? Or should he have followed the rules just this once? Comment stay real if you believe integrity matters more than approval. Comment follow the rules if tradition should always come first. And wherever you're watching from, remember this. The world doesn't change when people fit in. It changes when someone refuses to.